Hello, my name is Daniel Gray and I am the Head of History in the School of Humanities at the University of Hertfordshire. I'm a cultural and social historian, particularly interested in the relationship between gender, law and medicine in India and Britain from the late 18th century right through to the present. I'll be focusing today on two separate but closely interrelated themes regarding COVID-19 and its likely impact on India in order to talk about post-pandemic futures. The first of these is the context of public health, and, just as important, the second is state intervention, although in these particular circumstances it would perhaps be most accurate to talk about this moment for India as embodying both histories and futures of state repression instead of intervention. Despite the stringent lockdown imposed by Prime Minister Narendra Modi on the 24th of March 2020, giving just 4 hours warning to the entire population of 1.3 billion citizens that from midnight that night they would be forbidden from leaving their homes at all for the next 21 days, announcing that all non-essential businesses were to be shut for that period, and the fact that July has been heralded as marking what the government of India has called Unlock 2.0, the significant reduction of former lockdown measures, save in hotspot areas. Coronavirus continues to still spread rapidly across India. As of the 26th of June, India had reported over 450,000 confirmed coronavirus cases, making it the fourth worst affected country in the world, and with the capital, New Delhi, as the worst hit area. This number has continued to rise sharply over the past week. By the 2nd of July, just 5 days later, this had already catapulted to over 600,000 people being diagnosed with the disease. In the last 24 hours alone, 613 people died from coronavirus in India, and a further 25,000 new cases were recorded by the Ministry of Health. India is now expected to become the third worst affected country by coronavirus in the world within the next week. The government estimates over 500,000 further cases will be identified within the next 16 days, partly in response to the dramatic increase in testing and contact tracing now being carried out in the metropolis. And the New Delhi local authorities have set up what is estimated to be the world's largest field hospital site to cater for an expected 10,000 patients who are exhibiting mild to moderate symptoms of the virus. In contrast to these high numbers of reported sufferers, however, the official death rate attributed to COVID-19 patients in India is extremely low, estimated at 11 per million, which is considerably smaller than would normally be expected from such a high number of cases, and puts it into the lowest category for coronavirus mortality rates worldwide. Now, given the extreme difficulty involved for medics in confirming that a patient has died specifically from COVID-19 rather than another cause or COVID-19 related complications, and something which I should note here has also been suggested as leading to significant underestimates of coronavirus mortality in Britain as well as in India, the likelihood is that the true figure is inevitably much higher than the official records would suggest. It remains to be seen to what extent the new and much more extensive test and trace system will also lead to an increase in the number of recorded fatalities from COVID-19, as well as the number of patients so diagnosed, especially since the government of India is currently claiming such a low mortality rate as one of the nation's success stories. Indeed, the Health Ministry as of the 6th of July, was proclaiming that it has not one of the lowest such rates, but the lowest rate of COVID-19 deaths worldwide. And so, receiving a new set of data that directly contradicts this trend is unlikely to be looked on with any enthusiasm by the authorities. The situation here is further complicated by the paradoxical position facing public health workers in India. On the one hand, medicine and technology are subjects that hold tremendous status in India and are correspondingly highly valued in the 21st century. On the other, the public health system has been grossly under-resourced since at least the 1970s. Arguably, this is both a continuity and a legacy that extends from the period of colonial British rule that only ended in 1947, and in practice, only the very poorest and most desperate do not avail themselves of private healthcare. Pharmacists are often in practice willing to sell medicines or other drugs in as small quantities as a single dose to those of the working poor who can pay, even if they cannot afford an entire packet or course of treatment, which I think says something very telling about how healthcare operates in contemporary India. As the eminent medical historian Sarah Hodges has argued, it is corporate healthcare, rather than state-sponsored medicine or any mixed economy of care, which is perceived as having had a transformative impact on India's social and economic landscape since the 1980s, with companies such as the primarily Chennai-based Apollo Hospital Enterprise Limited held up, as she notes, as being critical, quote, examples of the country's capacity to deliver and given much of the credit for the nation's recent economic successes, to end quote. In addition to the already significant burden imposed by the global pandemic, India's efforts to roll out new and improved systems that can also be used to treat and check the spread of disease across the entire population are thus simultaneously having to contend with the ongoing impact of decades of the neglect and underfunding of public healthcare as a whole. One important consideration for India in a post-pandemic future, then, will be whether the experience of needing to try and contain such a highly contagious and dangerous virus across the country provokes a radical reassessment of the need and role for state-sponsored healthcare and, alongside this but not guaranteed even if such a reassessment occurs, whether budgets and resources should then be reallocated from other areas in order to fund a transformation and overhaul of the public health system. Moving away from the overwhelming reliance on private healthcare for the majority of Indian citizens, for all but the poorest, would necessitate drastic economic, political and social shifts, and a shake-up of the cultural assumptions that have been built up over the last 40 years about the inherently superior quality of private medicine. But the difficulties that the entire world has faced in tackling coronavirus, with India no exception, may mean that the nation concludes such sweeping changes to better support the public healthcare system are nonetheless essential, even if they are both expensive and unwelcome. One change ushered in by the pandemic, however, seems to be both indisputable and considerably less welcome than the possibility of greater state support for healthcare, and that is the way that Prime Minister Modi and the governing Bharatiya Janata Party, or BJP, have seized on the unprecedented circumstances of COVID-19 as a way to fast forward their agenda for the transformation of India and to silence their critics. Even without the impact of the global pandemic, the political situation in India has been, and still remains, extremely highly charged for some time, both domestically and on the international stage. Exacerbated in both cases by long-standing BJP rhetoric that it now has the power to act boldly upon, even more so than earlier after Modi came to power. a broadly right-wing party that claims Indian identity and Hinduism to be closely, if not inextricably, linked in a very essentialist manner, in defiance of India's centuries-long history of religious pluralism and syncretism, and the fact that the 1973 Constitution specifically defines the country as a secular republic. The ruling BJP is not only at present the world's largest political party in terms of membership, but holds trenchant positions on a number of highly contentious issues, including claiming the disputed territory of Jammu and Kashmir as unequivocally Indian soil, and being quick to retaliate against real or imagined enemies and critics, both at home and abroad. On the night of 16th of June 2020, the surprise meeting of Indian and Chinese troops in disputed territory along the Himalayan border region led to a pitched hand-to-hand battle of several hours, resulting in the loss of life on both sides. This was the worst conflict between the two powers since the brief but serious clashes of autumn 1967 that are sometimes referred to as the Second Sino-Indian War. Until early July, tensions continued to run high in the area, and although both Chinese and Indian diplomatic and military officials are and were publicly emphasizing their adherence to a policy of strict disengagement and negotiation, progress in these talks seemed for some weeks to have stalled completely. This tension, and the reluctance to be perceived internationally as backing down in the face of threats or tension, sits in parallel to the continued and ongoing lockdown that has been imposed on Jammu and Kashmir since the 5th of August 2019, when the Indian government abruptly revoked the special status that had long been accorded to Jammu and Kashmir under Article 370 of the Indian Constitution, and imposed a media and communications blackout on the region, citing concerns about terrorism. Although restrictions on landline phone access were lifted relatively quickly, internet access in Jammu and Kashmir is still very limited and remains confined to 2G networks only. The severe restrictions on internet usage have multiple ramifications, including the ability for residents to access education. One university student interviewed by the German news organisation DW in April noted this meant following the online classes provided by her institution was in practice impossible since it took an hour to download a single video. And unsurprisingly, it also has practical ramifications for those healthcare workers struggling to contain COVID-19 in the region. Although the Indian Supreme Court agreed in May to set up a committee to review whether the 4G ban should continue indefinitely or be rolled back, as of the middle of June, no practical steps had been taken to form the said committee, and still less had been done to explore other alternatives to a simple outright ban. Most recently, however, the arrest, bail and almost immediate rearrest in late May of two student activists in Delhi, Devangana Kalita and Natasha Nawal, gives grave cause for concern. Ms. Kalita and Ms. Nawal, both graduate students at Jawaharlal Nehru University and leading members of the Delhi women's rights organisation Pinjra Tod, or Break the Cage, were first arrested on the 23rd of May in relation to a sit-in protest back in February this year against the new Citizenship Amendment Act. Passed on the 11th of December 2019, this new law laid down that migrants who were Hindus, Christians, Sikhs, Jains, Buddhists or Parsis and had fled religious persecution in neighbouring countries such as Pakistan, Bangladesh and Afghanistan before the 31st of December 2014 were eligible to be fast-tracked for citizenship. And as you'll notice from this list, Muslims were specifically excluded. Taken in conjunction with ongoing plans to roll out across the country the National Register of Citizens that has until now been confined to the state of Assam, a measure which has been repeatedly alleged to discriminate against refugees and their descendants, in particular Muslim families, and potentially rendering such individuals stateless, The Citizenship Amendment Act has been argued by many critics to be an unsubtle first step towards removing citizenship from swathes of Indian Muslims more broadly, and a further step towards embedding the Hindu nationalist rhetoric espoused by many BJP officials and supporters in the law, and ultimately aiming at reform of the constitution itself. The sit-in, organised by Pinjra Tod in February, was one of many peaceful demonstrations against the new act that were held across India between December 2019 and the spring of 2020. One of the most prominent protests, the Shaheen Bagh sit-in led by Muslim women and estimated to have drawn as many as 100,000 protesters that blocked a major road in New Delhi, was ultimately only ended by the imposition of the coronavirus lockdown on the 24th of March. However, Pinjra Tod and its members had been recognised nationally as protesting unjust laws and regulations that impact on Indian women as early as autumn 2015, when the group organised protests against the sexist restrictions and curfews facing women students living in a large number of university hostels. It is difficult to avoid drawing the conclusion that COVID-19 and the organisation's involvement in the Anti-Citizenship Amendment Act protests were perceived by the authorities as a welcome opportunity to make a public example of what is at stake for those who criticise government policy. In the case of Ms. Nawal and Ms. Kalita, the duty magistrate who heard the charges was reported as ruling that while both women had been arrested under Section 186, which is obstructing a public servant in discharge of public functions, and Section 353, assault or criminal force to deter a public servant from discharge of his or her duty of the Indian Penal Code, nothing referenced in either the case file or in the first information report that had been provided to the court by police gave any indication that violence had been involved in any part of their protest. As such, the magistrate felt that the latter charge of assault on a public servant could not be reasonably sustained. Yet, almost immediately after being released on bail, Ms. Kalita and Ms. Nawal were then re-arrested on separate charges of murder, attempted murder, rioting, and criminal conspiracy. No further details of these alleged violent crimes related to the February protests seem to have been reported in the media, but the police applied to keep both women in custody for an additional 14 days, reduced to 2 days by the court, in order to support further investigations. As more than one media account of the sudden rush to arrest and charge protesters who demonstrated against the Citizenship Amendment Act has noted, the broader restrictions imposed by the fight against COVID-19 thus seem to have provided the government and police with a perfect opportunity to target their critics with relative impunity. Such overt and targeted state retribution for dissent has disproportionately followed lines of gender and faith. While Hindus and male activists who have criticised the Modi regime have indeed been targeted for arrest and detention along similar lines, a significant number of those subject to these unjust processes have been women of all faiths and Muslim campaigners of both sexes, whose criticisms are seen as especially galling and intolerable by those in power. Simultaneously, it is important to note that no action at all has been taken against either BJP Cabinet Minister Kapil Mishra, whose threatening denunciations of the Anti-Citizenship Amendment Act protesters in February have been described by many as helping to incite the riots that followed, or has been taken against those police officers who were caught in footage that promptly went viral across India, assaulting Muslim men while demanding they sing the national anthem as proof of their patriotism and national loyalty. These, like other instances of threats, violence, and even cases of alleged homicide perpetrated by state representatives in the last few years against those perceived as anti-national, a broad category of enemies within, which might, in the minds of some Indians who use the term, encompass anyone who either disagrees with government policy or is not part of the Hindu faith majority, have been effectively dismissed from further consideration by the government, police, or judiciary, even when formal complaints have been filed with the authorities. For those citizens old enough to remember the middle of the 1970s, or with a keen interest in contemporary history, there are troubling echoes here that resonate with the run-up to the infamous emergency period, the 21 months between June 1975 and March 1977, where then Prime Minister Indira Gandhi imposed rule by decree and censorship of the press, a situation which directly led to the unlawful detention and even torture of a number of Gandhi's political opponents and critics, as well as her son's enactment of a forced sterilisation program designed to help meet India's population control targets. In April 2020, the novelist Arundhati Roy wrote a powerful essay for the Financial Times on the impact of coronavirus in India, entitled "The Pandemic is a Portal." In this work, Roy argued that the unique circumstances and unprecedented times of COVID-19 offered the nation an invaluable opportunity for radical transformation, to either try to continue to hold on to older and potentially unhelpful attitudes and practices, or to remake the world anew for the benefit of all. I read this essay with great pleasure when it was first published, rereading it repeatedly for the eloquence of the prose and inspired by the hopeful message it carried. I think it is telling, however, that her more recent follow-up for the same magazine, published on the 23rd of May, is called "After the Lockdown, We Need a Reckoning." This emphasised instead the profound economic and social damage that has resulted in India from the way the government has approached tackling the virus, including the overt and heavy-handed repression of criticism and dissent among those who disagree with its policies. Arguably, the longer the global pandemic continues, the easier it will be for such repressive measures to become entrenched in India, and the harder it will be in the world's largest democracy for critics at all levels of society to express themselves without being targeted for retribution. Thank you for listening.